Our faith comes in moments. Our vice is habitual. Yet there is a depth in those brief moments which constrains us to ascribe more reality to them than to all other experiences. The Thin Red Line. Man, what a beautiful film. When people say that it is one of the greatest war films ever made, it's hard to disagree. The cinematography and editing is some of my favorites in any film, not to mention the incredible performances. There are so many moments that make you feel like you are watching something real and raw. Something you are not meant to see, but that would be wrong to ignore. It's a film that makes you feel, yet it is notoriously difficult to digest, to try and understand mentally what's going on. There are so many voiceovers talking about abstract philosophical topics that it can be easy to get disoriented and completely forget what's going on screen. In fact, it's like someone took two separate films and smashed them into one in order to make The Thin Red Line. On the one hand, you have entire sequences that are almost documentarian in their objectivity. Scenes that realistically recreate an historically unique form of warfare in a unique place on Earth, allowing us to see and maybe appreciate just a little the horrific conditions that college-aged men once endured in the South Pacific. But in between these straightforward moments, these philosophical voiceovers take us away from that specific moment in history as we start to question what these philosophical reflections on the nature of reality actually mean. Eventually, you start to lose your sense of what is happening in the movie itself. In fact, it often doesn't feel like there is a consistent plot. You rarely get a feeling for where the characters are or what they are supposed to be doing. I don't think the name Guadalcanal is even mentioned until halfway through the film, even though that's where the story takes place. And it's one of the most iconic campaigns in American history. But you could easily watch the film and completely miss that fact. Where are we? What are we doing? What's the point of it all? The film left me with so many questions that when I learned that it is based on a novel that was actually written by a man who fought on Guadalcanal, and which some consider to be the greatest World War II novel ever written, I immediately wondered how the book compared to the film. Is the novel more straightforward than the film? Does it have more detail? And can it help us to understand the film better? And what I discovered is that the novel, unlike the film, actually does give you a solid feeling of place and continuity, especially if you cross-reference it with maps of the historical campaign. And I think this is something really valuable about the novel. From the moment that the troops land on the beaches, we can trace their daily lives through the various battles they fight until they leave the island when Guadalcanal has been won. There is less philosophy and more everyday facts of life on Guadalcanal, and you get a feeling of existing day by day in an environment that is both beautiful yet miserable, with fear, anger, hatred, and lust as constant as malarial fever. For me, reading the novel absolutely enhances the film. The Thin Red Line takes place during the last stages of the campaign to capture the island of Guadalcanal from the Japanese during World War II. The Battle of Guadalcanal was the first major American campaign against the Japanese after Pearl Harbor. It began on August 7th of 1942 and lasted until February of 1943. So while the campaign lasted for half a year of grueling warfare, The Thin Red Line only covers the last few weeks of the campaign. And whenever you have a long campaign like this, with men constantly dying, being wounded, or just getting worn out by weeks of fighting, you have to constantly send fresh troops in to replace old ones. And that is where our story begins. We are introduced to Charlie Company as they are being carried on board a troop transport and preparing to land on Guadalcanal as reinforcements. The story is not about any one man, so much as it is about the company as a whole. The novel introduces us to some 20 men, a few of whom are focused on in the film. We follow these men as they are ferried onto the beaches of Guadalcanal, and they make the grueling trek to the battlefield. And already, there is a major difference here between the film and the novel. The film begins with a man named Private Witt, living among the native Melanesians of some island in the South Pacific. This is completely made up for the film, and we will talk about it later on when we discuss the film's themes, but for now I want to point out another major change that the film made. When Charlie Company lands on the beaches of Guadalcanal, the film makes it look like they march directly from the beaches to the battle. But in the novel, there is a 2-week interval between landing and their first engagement. And I think this is fascinating because apparently the climate of Guadalcanal is so brutal compared to that of America that new reinforcements had to be given a 2-week period to acclimatize to the new environment. The novel's descriptions of the climate are vivid. It was a march, the like of which none of them had ever experienced before. The moist humidity was so overpowering and hung in the air so heavily that it seemed more like a material object than a weather condition. It brought the sweat starting from every pore at the slightest exertion, and unable to evaporate in it, this sweat ran down over their bodies, soaking everything to saturation. When it had saturated their clothing, it ran on down into their shoes, filling them so that they sloshed along in their own sweat, as if they had just come out of wading a river. The sun blazed down on them between the widely spaced trees, heating their helmets to such temperatures that the steel shells actually burned their hands. During these 2 weeks, we get to know the men of C Company a little better as they explore their surroundings. In one episode, a group of non-coms raid an unguarded supply tent in order to procure a handful of Thompson submachine guns. And even though this is not shown in the film, I appreciate that we do see these same men carrying those very Thompsons from the book. And in a more gruesome scene, several men discover a mass, shallow grave of Japanese soldiers, whom they begin digging up and desecrating in search of souvenirs. And yeah, I suppose this is as good a place as any to mention that the novel is actually far more gruesome even than the film, and there is far more adult content in it. I know I have friends who care about reading that kind of stuff, and they are very careful about what they expose themselves to in art and entertainment, which I really respect, and I totally agree that it is important. And since books don't have the same content warnings as films, I figure I might as well let you know that if you were thinking about reading the novel, you should know that it is pretty graphic. When it comes time for Charlie Company to march to the line and engage in their first battle, they are tasked with taking part in an assault to capture a series of hills, which the novel calls the Dancing Elephant. And it's here that we encounter a kind of historical problem, because on Guadalcanal, there was no position with this name. And in fact, James Jones, the author of the novel, prefaced his book with a note that reads, "Anyone who has studied or served in the Guadalcanal campaign will immediately recognize that no such terrain as that described here exists on the island. The dancing elephant, the giant boiled shrimp, the hills around Bula Bula Village, as well as the village itself, are figments of fictional imagination, and so are the battles herein described as taking place on this terrain. The characters who take part in the actions of this book are also imaginary. So Jones claims to take the liberty of distorting the campaign and, quote, laying down smack in the middle of it a whole slab of non-existent territory. Now, this by itself wouldn't be much of a problem per se, especially since we are dealing with a novel of historical fiction and not a memoir or biography. But the problem is that it actually has been generally agreed upon that this section of the novel does, in fact, line up with the real-life assault on a position that was called the Galloping Horse, a battle that in itself was pretty remarkable. And thankfully, the novel and the film capture a lot of what makes this battle so incredible. Historians tell us the assault on the Galloping Horse launched on January 10th as part of a larger operation to capture the Guadalcanal Hill Country from the Japanese. This position here is the Galloping Horse. The Americans were assaulting from a downhill position on the east and pressing uphill to the west. However, the American assault continuously bogged down on the following 2 days due to the well-entrenched Japanese machine gun positions and mortar bombardments. Not to mention that the Americans struggled getting supplies and especially water up to their position. I think the film does an amazing job of showing the pure ordeal of trying to assault positions that you cannot see. Attacking uphill, when an enemy could pop out of the tall kunai grass a few feet in front of you at any moment. On January 13th, the assault had bogged down once again, and a captain named Charles Davis took a 4-man group of volunteers and reduced the Japanese machine gun positions, allowing the Americans to overwhelm the Japanese position and take the Galloping Horse. For this action, Davis was awarded the Medal of Honor. Now, in the novel and the film, the names of the men are changed, and the exact details of the battle, which I have hastily summarized, are changed. But the similarities are obvious. For example, a man named Captain Gaff leads 7 volunteers instead of 4 to take out the machine gun positions, and for this, Gaff is awarded the Medal of Honor, which is made especially clear in the novel. So that much is pretty straightforward. However, after this moment in the film, the continuity of events can once again get confusing because the film returns to its meditative voiceovers, and many things begin happening at once without a lot of clear orientation. But the novel does help us make sense of things. You see, while the 7 volunteers were attacking the elephant's head with Captain Gaff, the rest of C Company, under Captain Staros, are attacking a Japanese bivouac, somewhere off on the right flank. Private Witt, who took part in the volunteer raid, travels as a messenger by himself back down the hill to C Company, and he joins up with the attack on the Japanese bivouac. In the film, this is not really clear because of the montage. However, I can't complain too much because it is probably one of my favorite film montages of all time. I love the way the editing works with Zimmer's soundtrack to slowly build from quiet contemplation to the preparation to attack again, the uncertainty of advance, and finally the chaos of point-blank engagement. Just look at the way these shots of bayonet thrusts are put together, fractions of a second, in the rhythm of the rifle sounds with the sounds of cuts and swishes, and then we hit longer takes, which include tracking shots, handheld shots, static shots, all of them trying to bring us into the experience of the men who find themselves in the midst of what Private Train calls this great evil. This skirmish at the Japanese bivouac marks the end of the battle for the Dancing Elephant, aka the Galloping Horse. The fight has been so brutal and harrowing that Charlie Company is given a week of rest off the line. We see men playing in the water, drinking, fighting, going for solitary walks, thinking of home. The novel tells us that during their week of rest, the company is bivouacked on a hillside where every night they can see Henderson Airfield being bombed by the Japanese. And we also see Captain Staros, who in the novel is called Captain Stein, being relieved of his command because he disobeyed the order to attack the dancing elephant frontally in order to save the lives of his men. And in my personal opinion, the attack on the dancing elephant is the strongest part of the novel and the film. And the two actually line up pretty closely in terms of story beats. However, when it comes to the end of The Thin Red Line, the film and the novel are almost completely different. In the film, when C Company's week of rest is over, the film cuts, without any explanation, to the company marching through a running river, which, to me, seems a little bit odd. Kinda seems like a good way to damage your weapons and equipment if they get wet, but I'm not an expert, and while they do say in the film that the jungle is quote-unquote too thick to march through, that was never the case in the novel, which actually makes a point of highlighting that the troops had to cut through many parts of the jungle by hand, and that it was slow and arduous work. But I have to assume it was preferable to squatting in a river. Again, I'm not an expert. So the company is just sitting in this river, cut off from communication with their command post, isolated and worried that the Japanese could attack at any minute. So 3 men are sent to figure out where the sound power line has been cut so that they can talk to headquarters over the sound power telephone. And it is fascinating to me that before the use of handheld radios, these military units would basically just stretch miles of telephone wire behind them wherever they went so that they could communicate with their headquarters. However, if the enemy found those lines and cut them, the phones were useless. So in this situation, 3 men are sent to find where the line was cut. But it just so happens that they encounter what seems to be a Japanese reinforced battalion. 1 man is wounded, while another man, named Fife, runs back to warn Charlie Company. Meanwhile, Private Witt leads the Japanese away from the American troops, thus saving their lives, and in the process, he sacrifices his own. Evidently, C Company finds his body and gives Witt a shallow burial, but then we cut pretty abruptly to Charlie Company receiving a new commanding officer, and leaving the island of Guadalcanal in much the same way that we saw them arrive. Without any real fanfare, the battle is over, and C Company are on to their next mission. Now, as I said, the novel is very different. After their week of rest, Charlie Company is marched back to the Dancing Elephant, which is now in American hands. Their next mission is to capture a further position called the Giant Boiled Shrimp. Now, as far as I can tell, this position is more or less fictional. But these troop movements do generally seem to align with what actually happened after the Battle of the Galloping Horse. Namely, the American troops pushed further west, and encountering relatively light Japanese resistance, pivoted north to press the flank of the Japanese position. In the novel, C Company goes so far as to press all the way to the sea and attack a fictional village called Bula Bula somewhere east of Kokumbona. And I'm definitely not aware of any company that made that drastic of a movement during the campaign, but I will leave that to the historians. What I do like is the greater realism of the novel. As C Company is moving west and north, they encounter a dry riverbed that is used as a pathway for Japanese troops to move reinforcements. And the commander of C Company, a man named Band, orders a group of 12 volunteers to form a roadblock on that dry riverbed in order to stop any Japanese from moving along it. Among the volunteers are John Bell and Whit, who is now an acting sergeant, both of whom realize that this is a very dangerous move. Whit says that he thinks it's a bad idea, but he wants to go along to help, because if the Japanese do come down that road in any strength, these 12 men will be wiped out. And in fact, that is essentially what happens. During the night, a group of Japanese soldiers appear in the brush, one of whom has a machine gun strapped to his back. And this Japanese soldier drops to his knees while another Japanese soldier comes up behind him and uses the machine gun to mow down the American soldiers, while the Japanese man who is wearing the gun aims it by moving his shoulders back and forth. Now, I have no idea if that kind of thing ever actually happened, but it's a pretty crazy image. 10 of the Americans are killed, and the only 2 survivors are John Bell, who runs back to the company, and Whit, who dives into a hiding place and eventually escapes back to the company as well. From there, Charlie Company pushes on to attack the village of Bula Bula, which they have no orders to do, and it ends up delaying the American victory by a couple of weeks. However, at this point, the campaign and the novel are essentially over. The company does receive a new CO, and after a period of recovery, is loaded back onto the transport ships, headed to New Georgia. You probably noticed that an obvious difference between the novel and the film is that Whit never dies or sacrifices himself in the book. But believe me, that is not the only difference in these characters. While Jones's Private Whit does love Charlie Company, and is also a rebel, he is also shown to be a capricious and pugnacious drunk, willing to fight anyone at the drop of a hat, as well as a virulent racist. Terrence Malick transforms this character of Whit into a lover of all humanity, including the indigenous Melanesians, in order to set up a philosophical discussion of his own. While many critics tend to see The Thin Red Line as an anti-war film, I'm hoping that you can begin to see that it's not quite as simple as that. The center of the film is not necessarily a point or a thesis, but a question. A question that is asked at the very beginning of the film and at the very end. The first words that are spoken are, "What's this war in the heart of nature?"
Why does nature vie with itself? The land contend with the sea.
This film goes beyond politics and questions the very nature of nature, asking, why is there conflict in nature? Is predation inherent in the animal world? And if so, is human warfare simply one of the manifestations of nature's conflicts? The lion eating the zebra. Peace and love, whenever they do exist, are just islands in a sea of war.
Look at this jungle. Look at those vines, the way they twine around the trees, swallowing everything. Nature's cruel, Staros.
If nature is cruel, and if human beings are a part of nature, nothing more than a development in its evolution, then there can be nothing wrong with human cruelty. The fact that some people want peace and harmony does not cancel out the march of death on which universal common descent functions. If we are products of this cruel system, then who are we to overrule it? However, it is also obvious that nature is not only cruel, there is also love and nurture and harmony in it. So are there two separate powers in nature, love and cruelty? Or are these two things simply two sides of the same coin? Or, as Train again asks at the end of the film, are they the features of the same face?
Darkness and light, strife and love, are they the workings of one mind? The features of the same face? Oh, my soul, let me be in you now. Look out through my eyes. Look out at the things you made. All things shining.
Now, there is a lot to break down here. One of the oldest questions in philosophy and religion is the question of whether reality is one or many, unity versus multiplicity. And it is a very complicated question. The ancient pre-Socratic philosophers believed in a kind of unity of all things. When you turn to Parmenides and Zeno, the latter arguing that the world is a unity to such a degree that motion does not exist. And before him, there was Heraclitus, who enigmatically argued that the world is uncreated. The world is fire, but fire has a dual nature: hunger and satiety, war and peace. Everything is always changing, and it is the very fact that things change, morph, and crash into each other, destroying and creating, that allows all of these things to be united to each other. He said that God is day-night, winter-summer, war-peace, satiety-hunger, but he takes various shapes, just as fire, when it is mingled with spices, is named according to the savor of each. A religion like Christianity, which is represented in the film by the Melanesians at the beginning, who sing Christian hymns, as well as by Captain Staros, is considered to be more dualistic than materialism in that it teaches a God who is distinct from nature, and more dualistic than Heraclitus, in that it teaches that God is light, and in him is no darkness at all. Good is ultimate, evil is aberrant, and good will ultimately triumph over evil, including death and suffering. And based on these definitions, it is clear that Malick's film has representatives of many different beliefs. In fact, one of the critical observations made by Private Train is that two different men can look at the same thing and have two vastly different experiences.
One man looks at a dying bird and thinks there's nothing but unanswered pain. That death's got the final word. It's laughing at him. Another man sees that same bird, feels the glory. Feels something smiling through it.
Some characters emphasize a monism of cruelty and nature, while others emphasize the union of everything, even love and suffering. Still others represent the so-called dualism of Christianity, which the film clearly respects. However, it does seem to me that based on the final words of the film spoken by Train, the film ultimately wants to side with a version of monism. It might be too far to call it pantheism. However, I will say that the language it uses is, to me, very much in line with the American philosophy of transcendentalism, which was influenced by Eastern religions and is often considered pantheistic. Just listen to the words of transcendentalist Ralph Waldo Emerson when he talks about, quote, that unity, that oversoul, within which every man's particular being is contained, and made one with all other. We live in succession, in division, in parts, in particles. Meantime, within man is the soul of the whole, the wise silence, the universal beauty, to which every part and particle is equally related, the eternal one. So you can hear Emerson asserting that there is both division and unity in reality. One big soul. And he goes on to talk about how the soul shines through us. Quote, "The soul in man is not a faculty, but a light, is the vast background of our being, in which they lie. An immensity not possessed and that cannot be possessed. From within or from behind, a light shining through us upon things and makes us aware that we are nothing. The light is all." And this sounds very much like the voiceovers in The Thin Red Line.
Maybe all men got one big soul, everybody's a part of. All faces of the same man. One big self.
Not to mention that Emerson also talks about the soul creating things, just as Train talks about his soul creating the things around him. Quote, "The soul looketh steadily forwards, creating a world always before her, leaving worlds always behind her." Now at this point, if you've made it this far in the video, you may be wondering if transcendentalism says that there is a single oversoul connecting everything, how does war fit into all of this? Are darkness and light, love and conflict the features of one face, one soul? And the answer to that is complicated. For one thing, Emerson's rhetoric made it clear that even though all men are part of the oversoul, people are able to ignore it. And in fact, most people do. You can submit to the oversoul, or you can rebel against it. And war could be considered a rebellion against the unified oversoul. However, Emerson did say things about war in a lecture of March 1838 that are not exactly anti-war. Interestingly, Emerson even sounds reminiscent of Colonel Toll when he says, "The microscope reveals miniature butchery in atomies and infinitely small biters that swim and fight in an illuminated drop of water, and the little globe is but a too faithful miniature of the large, of the whole earth." What does all this war, beginning from the lowest races and reaching up to man, signify? Is it not manifest that it covers a great and beneficent principle, which nature had deeply at heart? What is that principle? It is self-help. Nature implants with life the instinct of self-help, perpetual struggle to be, to resist opposition, to attain to freedom, to attain to mastery. And to each creature, these objects are made so dear that it risks its life continually in the struggle for these ends. A man like Colonel Toll is focused on helping himself, seeking his own advancement. And we see the exact same thing on a smaller level with John Bell and his wife. When Bell receives a letter from his wife asking for a divorce, her reasoning is simple. She just got too lonely. She does not want to put up with the pain, and she meets someone else who will make her feel better than John, or Jack as he is called in the film. On the surface, this reminds us of the scope of human suffering that war causes beyond the horrific loss of life. It also breaks up families. But more deeply, it shows us the cause of war itself. The reason why nations rage against each other is the same reason why two people break up. Seeking your preferences and your pleasure and your happiness over another's. Or what is trickier for people to understand, war is caused by the attempt to escape suffering. Japan invaded Manchuria and the South Pacific in pursuit of resources to allay the Great Depression.
Japan's answer to the economic blizzard of the Depression was war. First, an invasion of Manchuria, and then China. Japan had few natural resources and a rapidly increasing population. She determined to take the raw materials and living space that she wanted by force.
America deployed its navy to Hawaii to protect those same resources in the South Pacific, which were controlled by Western powers. Neither side wanted to accept loss or suffering. However, even if war does spring from this natural impulse for self-help, everyone who has an intact conscience knows that even though there is a rational justification for what someone like Colonel Tall does, and for what John Bell's wife does, we know that what they do is wrong. And Emerson is clear that the same applies to war in general. In the same speech, he says that men have higher instincts that should eventually take the fangs out of war. War is juvenile and temporary, and morality, along with trade, education, art, and above all, religion, should make war look like fratricide, which, he says, is what it is. Again, this is exactly what we see in The Thin Red Line. We see a warlike instinct that is part of the fabric of the universe. When Private Witt visits another Melanesian tribe on the island of Guadalcanal, it seems that these Melanesians are not Christians, but rather follow their own traditional religion, as indicated by the presence of human skulls being displayed on shelves, which remind us of the complex practice of using skulls as trophies among the Solomon Islanders. Sometimes the skull of a revered tribal chief might be preserved out of pride, but headhunting was also a common facet of war, and represents the celebration of superiority and violence, even in the most primitive recesses of human nature. Now, it's not necessarily the case that Malick's film is meant to express transcendentalist philosophy specifically. One of the interesting things about Terrence Malick is that he is a legitimate academic philosopher, so I have little doubt that he is familiar with transcendentalism. However, the film may simply reflect his own views and questions at the time of its making. Either way, I think Emerson serves as a helpful frame to better understand what the film is trying to do. Namely, it recognizes the reality of war and conflict as inextricable parts of nature, including human nature, as it now is. Yet the film is also yearning for something better. In fact, I think it does show a successful movement towards something better in the midst of inescapable war. I think it shows that good men are able to have a good influence, even though it's not necessarily the way they expect or the way they want. In the relationship between Captain Staros and Colonel Tall, we see that Staros is able to save the lives of some of his men. And even though Tall relieves him of his command, which makes Staros wonder if he's doing any good, the last time that we see Colonel Tall, it seems like he is having regrets about the deaths of his men as he sits by himself and looks at the bodies of the fallen. Another good man, like Private Witt, is also able to genuinely save other people's lives when he sacrifices himself, which is the ultimate refutation of Sergeant Welsh. Previously, Welsh had challenged Witt by saying that there's nothing one man can do for anybody else.
If you're smart, you take care of yourself. There's nothing you can do for anybody else. Just running into a burning house where nobody can be saved. What difference you think you can make, one single man, in all this madness? If you die, it's going to be for nothing.
And while Witt was not apparently able to say anything in response at that time, we do hear the melody of the hymn, "Take my life and let it be, always only for my king," which tells us what Witt, and maybe even the film itself, ultimately believes about the ability of humans to live for something bigger than themselves. If nothing else, we know that his sacrifice proved that he could at least save the lives of his friends. Unfortunately, Welsh responds to this sacrifice only pessimistically by saying, "Where's your light now? It seems he can't see anything good in it." Welsh cannot see the light. He sees only unanswered pain, yet it is precisely because his pessimism springs from a certain kind of solicitude that he becomes a strange kind of contradiction within himself. He shows us that it is not just nature that is at war with itself, but that some men are at war inside themselves. And we know this because Private Witt says that Welsh cares deeply about him, but often makes himself out like a rock. And this contradiction also explains his closing words, which seem to reveal two points of view coexisting inside of him. On the one hand, when a man finds himself in an army driven by lies, the only thing he can do is find something that belongs to him and make an island for himself. But on the other hand, Welsh also speaks to someone unknown, saying, "If I never meet you in this life, let me feel the lack." In other words, let me feel the absence of not making the acquaintance of the unknown person. It sounds like he desires to know all people, and if there is any human he does not know, he wants to feel that absence. Just one glance from another's eyes, and he will give himself to them. The two seemingly contradictory sentiments. Perhaps Welsh is meant to mirror the paradox that Train sees in nature and man, namely the coexistence of light and darkness. But the difference between the two men is that Welsh suppresses his spark, hides his solicitude, covers up his light, so to speak, while Train wants to feel the glory, wants to feel something smiling, even through the horrors of war. He wants to see everything shining. It's in this philosophy that Malick's film is most different from Jones's novel, which smacks heavily of the 1960s anti-war atmosphere in which it was in fact written, though its author had personally served on Guadalcanal many years before he sat down to write a fictional story about it. A story in which there is no good in war, nothing shining, only absurdity and evil. There are no heroes, only victims, only cogs in a machine. In fact, the title, The Thin Red Line, comes from a Rudyard Kipling poem called Tommy, which is about how soldiers are mistreated by their superiors and by society in general, but they get lip service praise whenever society wants them to go and die. In everyday life, they are thrown to the back of the line, but when there's danger, society wants them out at front. For it's Tommy this and Tommy that, and chuck him out, the brute. But it's savior of his country when the guns begin to shoot. It's thin red line of heroes when the drums begin to roll. However, the Tommy of Kipling's poem responds to this hollow praise by saying, "We aren't no thin red heroes, nor we aren't no blackguards too. but single men in barracks, most remarkable like you. This is the essence of Jones's novel and its greatest thematic similarity with Malick's film. This is the story of single men, individual men with their own lives, their own desires, their own will to live, their own fear of death, and they are remarkably like us, like each other, like their enemy. We are all united in some mysterious way, much the same way as water pervades every living thing, seeming to blur the boundaries between us. Yet, the line between us is real. We are still individuals, though that line is not so thick that we cannot see ourselves on the other side of it, or even to cross it, for better or for worse, as the case may be.